Hello and welcome back to Everard Junction. I've just finished a little project framing some of the scenery in. You can see those nice fascia boards on the front of the layout, really tidy things up. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to address a popular comment of recent videos, and that's to give a tour of the layout and more importantly the room itself and how everything sort of fits in the space. So the layout is located in the attic of the house, and what I've done with the layout is go around the circumference of the loft, because that gives me the biggest possible layout to play with. Obviously if I just did a traditional baseboard in the middle of the room, it wouldn't be so large. So the layout is simply a square, and it goes around the entire edge of the attic. And you can see it comes back around to the ladder in the corner. The attic is fully insulated with insulation boards, which I did a number of years ago, and then I've also gone over the top of that with some just cheap white-faced hardboard, as it helps sort of brighten up the room, get a bit of reflection. And then there are about 12 lights installed in various locations around the room to give the best possible lighting, make the place nice and bright and airy. And most of these bulbs are in fact LEDs as well. So you can see I have lighting pointing directly at the layout itself, and then I have more ambient lighting for the room, so there's no sort of dark corners. Quite a common issue with the attic obviously is it can be a very dark place. Even with a couple of lights installed, it can be difficult to enjoy a layout in this location. So it's taken a few years to get to this stage, but the more lights the better really, and it's now nice and bright and airy, and I've been using this format for the last 3 or 4 years. Over by the Fiddle yard, got controls for various lights, and then over here I have the last lights for the rest of the room. And you can see we're completely in darkness, and once the layout is fully lit and I've got all the street lights and the rest of the coaching stock all illuminated, I'm really looking forward to how the layout's going to look, but that's quite a ways off yet. So back over by the ladder again, if we start here, we'll do a sort of a whistle-stop tour around the layout. I'll point out a few things along the way. So this is the Fiddle yard. There is a video for building this. I made it a couple of years ago, and it's basically, in simple terms, it's somewhere to keep all the various models in a spot where you can quickly access them and get them out onto the railway. You imagine if I didn't have this, having to take on and off all of this stuff every time I wanted to change trains or wanted to get a different locomotive going or whatever it might be. So you'll find a lot of larger layouts will use a fiddle yard, which is basically a board filled with tracks, and you can see how the trains route their way through there, and by setting the points I can access different trains and get different things running around the layout in a short space of time. So there's 4 main routes that run around the layout, and when they enter the Fiddle yard they split into a number of different routes, but basically what we have is for the 2 sets of relief lines, we've got 4 tracks each for there, so each relief line can have up to 4 trains stored on it, and then at the back there the main lines have 3 lines each. The house is a 1930s house, so we do have the benefit of very few timbers supporting the roof. The few that are here are very overbuilt and over-engineered, but it is very nice not having so many bits of timber to clamber over that you get with a lot more modern houses. So moving along the length of the Fiddle yard, we reach this end, and this is sort of the countryside section of the layout, which breaks out into the first part of the scenery. We also have the reverse loop at the back there for the branch line, which you've seen in a previous video, and I also just about have the remnants here of the old small fiddle yard that I did have for the previous incarnation of the branch line, which some of you may have seen a couple of years ago, or in fact a year ago. So these tracks run out onto the main lines on the layout, and then that single one is just for the branch line, and as it happens the Class 101 is on its way. You can see how run underneath the main lines. Plenty of scenery to still do in this area, of course. Disappears off scene and will eventually make its way around the reverse loop. There you can see it's on its way. Obviously with the track completely looping back onto itself, you'll end up with issues with the polarity of the rail switching sides. So there are some isolating joiners on that point in the background just there to make this whole section a separate area from an electrical standpoint, and the little box of tricks over here does its stuff and it switches the voltage as trains run around it with no need for any mechanical switches or anything like that. So from there we move on to the first scenic part of the layout. This is the what I like to call the countryside section, with the idea being that we're slowly passing more and more urban scenery until we eventually reach a town where the station would be. I was always quite fond of that idea. I always like to have a little bit of countryside on the layout. It's always nice to see the trains running through some sort of green and pleasant land, as opposed to just running through buildings and stuff where perhaps they might be obscured from view. So I try and strike the best of both worlds on this layout by having a mix of town and country. The curves on the layout are all banked as if they would be in real life, or super elevated if you prefer the term, and I quite like it. It's sort of a nice visual effect. There's a few places where it's a little bit clumsy, but it's the first time I ever tried it, so certainly if I ever tried it again in future I'd take a few more precautions, but for the most part it's really nice to see the trains banking in and out of the turns. And also you need to appreciate that normal viewing distance, say here, you're not going to see the odd slight discrepancy, but obviously in a lot of cases when I'm filming, being really brutal and being really zoomed in, something like that, you're going to see the slightest thing, half a mil of error will show up massively. The other train will bob up and down in the frame there, but it's because we're so heavily zoomed in. And that's one of the challenges, because everything is so small, trying to keep everything in focus, trying to keep everything filmed, and trying to make everything look as good as you possibly can, when in real life you see most of it from this sort of distance. So eventually we'll be having some more scenery obviously over the back there to make things look more convincing. This section here will be a road. I thought a road would be a fair sort of thing to try and cover up the fact we're entering a non-scenic section of the layout. Quite often you'll see tunnels and stuff on layouts to obscure where the trains are going, but when you've got a 4-track main line there with the tracks so close together, it's highly improbable for them to all be going into the same tunnel portal, so I elected to build a road bridge, albeit a timber one, which I'll eventually scenic in the future. As we work our way down, you can see how the branch line is starting to join up to the main lines as it heads around the curve, and this is the main sort of trees and bushes and woodland section of the layout. Lots of trees made from seafoam, and lots of scatter materials, different types from various different manufacturers. I was quite pleased with how this came out, as I'd not really tackled seafoam trees before. And then just for a bit of scenic interest there, we've got a drainage sort of ditch, got a culvert over there, an overflow pipe, and then I've added some of the woodland scenics murky water, and you can see how it picks up the reflections of the trees, and if you get the angle right, it also picks up the reflection of the trains. And then there you can see more of the lighting installed as well. These are some of my old fluorescent tubes, but they're still going. When they eventually burn out, I'll replace those with LEDs. But the idea is to try and keep a good light source on the layout all the way around the room, both for my enjoyment but also for ease of filming, trying to keep that depth of field and keep things in focus. So as we work our way around, the countryside begins to thin out. We start to get into a bit more of an urban scene, and we'll see a little bit more industry. Got a little flight of steps just there for railway staff to gain access to the lines, and a small signal and a few other little bits of detail. The signal's still pending wiring, that needs to all be wired up, and there's various little trackside details and accessories which I have planned here, but I've yet to add them just yet. There's always something to do, never run out of jobs on a model railway. So as we move up the line, you can see how the branch starts to join onto the main portion of the layout, and we start to get some more urban town scenery, including this small little industrial estate in the foreground, which I built last year. And we've also got that block of flats, which I built towards the end of last year. So there's lots of detail to add to this section. It's really only the bare bones in this particular part. And I've also got to integrate the fascia boards into the scenery, and that will all be done at a later date. But it is nice to have these boards installed now. You can stand back a little bit more and you don't see all of the sort of foam and the glue and the woodwork and all of the mess that comes along with building the scenery. So you can see here we've got a small sort of used car lot slash independent garage. We've got a commercial specialist just there, the scratch built unit, which is based on one local to where I live. And then we move into the scrapyard, which has been subject to various videos over the last year or so. It's certainly the most detailed part of the layout so far, and I really had a lot of fun making it. The block of flats is still in a relatively early stage of construction, and it's missing lighting, weathering and all sorts of details both on the interior and the exterior. I've not got around to getting back on it just yet, but it's still one of my favourite buildings. I was really pleased it came out sort of the way I was hoping for, a nice brutalist monstrosity overlooking a scrapyard, sort of perfect urban rundown scene. So moving along from the scrapyard, that then gets cut off by this canal. Again, this was subject to a relatively recent video. It's still looking good. I was really pleased with the water ripples and the junk and the litter, as well as the 3D print of the canal boat. It came out nicely. And it serves as a nice cut-off between this more industrial scene to work into a more sort of residential scene, a more sort of town-type scene. So now things start to get more urban. We break out into a retaining wall, sort of echoing some parts of London and a few other places in the country. And we've got a nice row of Victorian terraced houses. These houses are still very much under construction, just haven't had time at all to make any progress on them, but they certainly will get finished over the next year or so, and I look forward to adding lighting and interiors to those and really bring this street alive. That's then supplemented by this office building, which is another scratch build. That also featured in a relatively recent video, and you can see we've got a few shops and stuff on the ground floor just there, and all of the interiors are fully detailed and populated. I'll be adding another building off to the side of it to curve around this corner and sort of bring the town scene to life and try and integrate it a little bit more, bring it right up to where the scenery gets cut off, and that should look quite good looking down the street. Then of course here we have the road system, which is powered by the Magna Rail system, which I have also made a video on a couple of years ago now. I hope to update that video at some point in the not too distant future. I learned a lot since I originally made that video and installed the system, and this is my second go basically at putting the Magna Rail system in, and it's incredibly reliable. It just works, and it's really nice to just fire it up and leave it running, and the cars just behave themselves and go round and round and round for hours on end. The Magna Rail system is just powered by a Gauge Master DC controller, specifically the Model D, and that used to run my childhood layout from many years ago, and I've just repurposed it to run the vehicles. And obviously being an analog DC controller, you get some lovely control of the vehicles. You can run at various speeds and even, you know, slow down to a sort of realistic stop, you know, if I was filming it for any reason, trying to do a little scene. This section here that's just got a couple of spare cars in will eventually house another building. Not exactly sure how I'm going to do it yet, and I don't want to make the building too tall because I don't want to obscure this view out towards the railway itself, but certainly some sort of a building in there would look quite nice. I did contemplate a green or, you know, playground, something like that, something flat and open, but I really quite like the idea of just built up urban scenery that you would find in a major town. Moving down the street, got a little bit more of an industrial area here, just a little something tucked in the corner, just a couple of roller shutter doors. Whether or not they're actually in use is anybody's guess, but I was quite pleased with that. And then there's just a little bit of greenery, foliage, litter, graffiti, the sort of thing that you'd find in a typical town in an area like this. And then moving around, we start to head towards the station section of the layout, and this contains the only siding I actually have on the scenic part of the layout. At the moment it's just got a couple of locos in it, as you can see. I also park the odd DMU in there and reverse it through the points so that I can change tracks basically with the DMUs, and you see the points down there. So the DMUs can come into the siding and then they can go back down the track, sort of like a terminating service, if you will. Just a little bit of operational interest and flexibility, but for the most part I've tried to keep the track pan really simple. I'm not one for shunting and moving trains around endlessly. I just like to see the trains running around the room, doing their thing. Lovely way to relax, and that's the enjoyment of the layout for me. So I don't really feel the need for lots of sidings and tracks going all over the place. I prefer scenery that happens to have a railway running through it, rather than a railway that has scenery plastered around the edges to make it look a bit more realistic. And that was always the goal with this layout, to try and keep the track plan relatively simple while still providing lots of moving trains and operational interest. So moving round from the town part of the layout, the idea now is it would build up considerably more into a more urban, bigger town, but as you can see most of it is relatively unfinished. It's still very much a work in progress over on this side. So this section will eventually become the station. You can see we've got all 4 tracks running through the station there, and the branch line terminates just here in a bay platform. So I've got lots of work to do in this section. I've got quite a few ideas for what I want to achieve, sketch some of those out, and that should hopefully really get going in the next couple of months or so, especially as the weather starts to cool down a little bit. But that will be my winter project really. We'll be getting the station looking a bit more respectable. As I say, I've got plans for it, and one of the other projects I've also started, as you can see, the back scene here has disappeared, and what I've managed to do is I had a long think about the back scenes. I've always wanted to have another go at those, as I'd never done back scenes before. They've lasted a long time, lasted a good couple of years. They still look fair on the rest of the layout. They don't look too bad, but there are numerous joins, and I would like to try and reduce the number of joins. And at the time when I built them, I didn't think I was going to have the clearance, but as you can see, I've constructed this framework here with a flat face, and it does fit in there, which means it will also fit around the rest of the room, and that will allow me to have considerably longer sections of back scene, which will greatly reduce the number of joins in it, and it should just make the layout look that little bit more impressive, especially on a long panning shot. As you can see on the branch line, the units that are running on it drive into the platform, and they then slow down and stop and wait for a predetermined amount of time. I think this one's set to wait for 30 seconds or something like that, and it's just a nice bit of interest. As I don't have any shunting abilities on the layout, and while I'm not one for shunting, it is nice to have a train just automatically stopping and starting and changing direction and doing its thing. And that's powered by a Lens BM1, which is a very simple piece of circuitry that goes hand in hand with the lens control system that I use on this layout. That's what's known as a Lens BM1. Very simple piece of circuitry, very cheap, and it's perfectly possible to make your own one just using a bunch of diodes. That's all it really is, and as you can see, I only need 2 wires to install it. It's wired up into a predetermined braking section on the line, and it's connected to this right hand rail. And where is it? There it is. So you can see there's a cut in the rail just there to isolate it from the rest of the system. And then that little circuit board is connected to this rail, which runs all the way down into the platform, and when the unit enters this section, it picks up a special signal from this on the DCC. It knows it's entered a braking section, and it will slow down, stop, and then you can program what it does when it stops. And in my case, I've got it to wait a predetermined amount of time, change direction, and then depart back down the branch line. So you basically get continuous running on a line that is effectively an end-to-end or dead end. You don't have to manually slow it down and stop every time. As you can imagine, if I just wanted to operate the branch line and I had to do it manually, I would spend the operational time on the layout just concentrating on not crashing the train on the branch line. For me personally, I just like to sit down and watch the trains go by. So it works perfectly for me, as I don't have to do any driving. And as if by magic, it's arrived back at the station. And you can see how it's slowing down nice and gradually. Again, you can set that in the decoder, it's all programmable. And it's drawing to a stop. There you go, it stopped, and you saw the lights on the locomotive or DMU change. So it's changed direction, and after about 30-40 seconds it will head back off down the branch line, and it will do that all day. So as you can see, this station is a reasonable size. It's not massive. Problem with stations on railways is they're very, very large places, and if you were building a model of a complete station, well, it would pretty much take up the entire layout. So a common trick that a lot of people do, including myself, is you make these relatively short platforms here, and then they'll go under some urban scenery incorporated in the station itself, station building around here somewhere, who knows at this point, but it looks like the station has more to it than what there really is. And that just allows me to have a station but not allow it to dominate the entire layout. The layout would mostly be a station if I wanted to accommodate a 12-coach train. So this section here will form the scenic break where things go back into the Fiddle yard again. You can see it's just serving as temporary rolling stock storage for the time being, and this will eventually house some of the station buildings and other urban scenery. And I'll also be bringing this scenic break up considerably higher, so we don't see over the back just there, a bit more in line to that framework for that back scene just there. And as I said already, I'm working to improve the back scenes so they'll eventually make their way around the rest of the layout too. For those of you that haven't seen it before, this is the control system that I use. It's an LH100 system by Lens. I believe this is still the current model that they make. I've had this for about 10 or so years, and it's been very reliable, not really given me any major issues at all. It can be a little bit clunky to use, and the interface is a little bit different. It takes a little bit of getting used to. Some of the other DCC systems, newer systems, are a little bit more user-friendly, but I know how this works and I get on with it. It works fine for me. In future I might upgrade, but I haven't got any immediate plans just now. The only thing I don't really like about it is it has these funny spongy buttons, and it looks a little bit like a car phone from a BMW 8 Series from about 1991. It certainly shows its age, but it's a very, very reliable system, very solid, very dependable. And incidentally, most of the decoders that are in the trains are all Lens as well, and they work exceedingly well. They're not cheap, but I do make the effort to purchase those as and when. The trains just run superbly with those installed. And that brings us back around by the ladder where we started, back into the Fiddle yard. So you can see the layout really is quite simple, but that's one of the secrets for having a layout that works well and is enjoyable and you use for many years. Don't go crazy. Try and keep things simple, and you'll end up with something very reliable that works, and you can enjoy it with friends and family and not constantly have to clean track and sort out derailments and things like that. That's a trap I fell into on the previous layout. It was too complex for its own good. So this one I set out to not go too mad, have everything on the same level, try and keep the track pan relatively simple, not too many points, not too many sidings, and just let the trains run around the room, sit back and enjoy it. So I'll take you through a couple of the other bits and pieces that I have up here, just so you get a better picture of how things work. So over here I have a small portable heater, and I give this a quick blast in the winter for about 10-15 minutes. It warms up the room, and then it's nice and comfortable up here, and I can carry on modelling and running trains and building stuff in relative comfort, even on freezing cold days. I've got an old 1990s vacuum cleaner over in the corner here, and that is always up here, is always with me, because you're constantly, as you're building the scenery, always having to vacuum excess materials and keep the dust off of the layout and try and keep the room relatively clean and tidy and all those things. So I always keep that up here, and most times I visit the layout, that will get used for one thing or another. Also over in the corner by the ladder, I have a couple of fire extinguishers. You can never be too careful, so I always make sure there's a fire extinguisher up here just in case something dreadful was to happen. Before anybody says anything, I have had experience with fire extinguishers, do know how to use one. I've had the misfortune of having to use fire extinguishers in anger on 2 occasions at my place of work, and let me tell you, it's not fun. In the centre of the room, which you've noticed a couple of times, I have a small workbench. It's just something I threw together a couple of years ago, and it serves as a little bit of storage, a little bit of rolling stock storage, and somewhere to keep a few tools and things like that. I don't typically do a lot of the modelling on the layout actually up here on the bench. I prefer to do it downstairs. I've got a much larger workbench downstairs with more materials and things available to me. So if I'm not actually working on the scenery itself, I'm working on something that can be transported to and from the layout, then I will typically do that elsewhere, downstairs where it's more comfortable. But on those occasions where I'm up here working for an extended period of time, it's always handy to have a workbench where you can keep a few bits and pieces. So there you go, hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully it answered a couple of questions with regards to where the tracks go and how the layout integrates itself into the room. As you can see, it basically just goes around the edge of the attic as close as I can get it to the wall and the roof to create the biggest possible layout I can. And the track plan's relatively simple to keep things nice and reliable. And as I said previously, I just like to watch the trains running around the room. So I hope you enjoyed it. I know it's a little bit of a different subject to what we usually do. We're usually building stuff all the time, but I did notice a lot of you were asking for something along the lines of a layout tour. So I hope that answered your questions, and as always, I'll be back as soon as I can when I've made some more progress on the layout.